Picture yourself walking alone at night, the road dimly lit by the pale glow of the moon. The silence is heavy, broken only by the sound of your own footsteps. Then, from the shadows, she appears, a woman of extraordinary beauty. Her eyes shimmer, her voice is soft, and her smile feels almost magnetic. You can't help but be drawn closer. But in an instant, her disguise begins to falter. One leg is no longer human, but made of gleaming brass. The other seems twisted and unnatural, the flesh of a beast. Her hair flickers like living fire, her face shifting faster than your mind can register. What was once enchanting is now horrifying. This is Empusa, a creature of Greek mythology feared by travelers and whispered about by children who dared to leave their beds at night. She was both seductress and monster, capable of luring mortals to their doom before devouring them. To the Greeks, she was the very embodiment of beauty, masking danger, the nightmare that waited on the road when the world was asleep. Some call her the closest thing the ancient Greeks had to a succubus, a demonic woman who drained the life from those she deceived. But unlike the succubi of medieval lore, Empusa's story is tangled in Greek folklore, comedy, and ghost tales. Part myth, part superstition, part cultural fear. And tonight we step into her world. This is the story of Empusa, the succubus of Greek mythology. To understand Empusa, we need to step back into the shadowed corners of Greek belief, where the world of gods and spirits blurred into superstition, and where the night itself was filled with things best left unseen. Empusa wasn't counted among the mighty Olympians or even the great titans. She existed instead on the fringes in the realm of phantoms, witches, and restless spirits. According to ancient tradition, she was a daughter of the goddess Hecate, the torch-bearing deity of witchcraft, necromancy, and the crossroads. Just as Hecate ruled the boundary between life and death, Empusa moved within those same liminal spaces, slipping between the worlds of the living and the dead. Some accounts describe her not just as Hecate's offspring, but as one of her handmaidens, sent out at night to haunt lonely roads and frighten travelers. In this role, she functioned almost like an extension of Hecate's will, a living warning of the dangers that stalked those who strayed into forbidden places after dark. But Empusa wasn't entirely alone in her kind. Greek folklore abounded with nightwalkers, spectral women who preyed on men, children, and wanderers. Empusa was often mentioned alongside these beings, sometimes confused with them, sometimes distinguished as something more unique. Together, they formed a shadowy sisterhood of terror, all bound by a common theme: beauty that concealed danger, hunger that could never be satisfied. The name Empusa itself is telling. In Greek, it can be translated as one who leaps upon. It paints a picture of a predator lying in wait, springing onto its victim in a flash of horror. To the Greeks, this wasn't just mythological flavor, it was a name that carried real menace. Unlike the lofty tales of gods and heroes, Empusa belonged to the world of everyday fears. She wasn't part of grand epics or divine struggles for power. Instead, she was the thing you might encounter when you walked alone at night, or the figure your mother warned you about if you dared to sneak out after dark. She lived in the whispered stories passed from generation to generation, feeding not only on flesh, but on the unease that comes from the unknown. And though she would later appear in the plays of Aristophanes, where her frightening nature was twisted into comedy, her origin was anything but amusing. She was born as a warning, the embodiment of what happens when mortals are lured off the safe path, seduced by what they should fear. Empusa's place in Greek belief, then, wasn't one of glory, but of dread. She was a servant of the night, a weapon of Hecate, and a reminder that in the ancient world, the shadows themselves could be hungry. When the Greeks spoke of Empusa, they rarely described her in a single fixed form. She was not like Medusa, with snakes for hair carved permanently into her identity, or the Minotaur, forever trapped in his half-bull shape. Empusa was a creature of transformation, a shapeshifter whose appearance depended on what she wanted you to see. At her most alluring, she appeared as a maiden of breathtaking beauty. Her figure was perfect, her voice gentle, her movements graceful, and her smile enough to disarm even the most cautious traveler. To a weary man walking alone, she was the embodiment of comfort and desire, a vision so irresistible that resistance itself became impossible. This illusion was her weapon, a facade carefully designed to mask what lay beneath. But peel back the mask, and the truth was grotesque. Empusa was never truly human. Ancient accounts tell us that she had one leg of gleaming brass, a cold, metallic limb that shone unnaturally in the moonlight. Her other leg, in sharp contrast, was described as the leg of a beast, sometimes a donkey, sometimes a cow, sometimes rotten flesh. This disturbing combination gave her an appearance that was both monstrous and uncanny, a reminder that she belonged to no natural order. Her hair was said to burn like living fire, a crown of flames that danced around her head and marked her as something otherworldly. Her face, too, could shift in an instant, one moment radiantly beautiful, the next hideous beyond comprehension. She was never one thing for long, always changing, always unstable, like a nightmare you can't pin down. This duality was more than just for show, it carried meaning. The brass leg symbolized the cold, unfeeling nature of her existence, unyielding, merciless, inhuman. The beast's leg revealed her animal hunger, her raw instinct to hunt and consume. And her beauty, carefully draped over these horrors, was the final trap. Empusa was a living paradox, crafted from the things men feared most and desired most, fused into a single terrifying form. When you looked at Empusa, you could never trust your eyes, and when she revealed her true form, it was always too late. Empusa was not simply a monster to be seen, she was a force to be experienced. Her powers were rooted in fear, desire, and deception, weaving them together into something more dangerous than brute strength ever could be. As we just mentioned, her most infamous ability was shapeshifting. In Aristophanes' The Frogs, she flickers between forms with dizzying speed: a cow, a mule, a beautiful woman, a dog, even a serpent. The shifting was not just meant to confuse, it was meant to terrify. To see her transform in the blink of an eye was to be reminded that she belonged to no world, bound by no natural laws. For the Greeks, shape-shifting creatures were terrifying precisely because they could not be trusted. Empusa's very body was a lie. Yet her greatest weapon was not her power to change shape, but her power to seduce. Once her prey was entranced, she struck, draining their blood, devouring their flesh, or consuming their very life force. Some accounts say she feasted on men as a vampire would, others that she swallowed their essence whole, leaving nothing behind but a corpse and a memory. But Empusa's role was not limited to predation. She was also a creature of torment, a specter sent to haunt, frighten, and unsettle. To meet her on the road might not always mean death. Sometimes it meant madness, or humiliation, or being chased through the night by a horror that laughed as it pursued you. The Greeks often used her as a figure to frighten children into obedience. Mothers whispered that Empusa would come for the disobedient, creeping into the night to leap upon them. In this sense, she became both a supernatural threat and a moral lesson, a living warning against wandering where you didn't belong. Her connection to Hecate sharpened this role. As a servant of the goddess of witchcraft, Empusa's behavior tied into the imagery of the crossroads, those liminal places where the living and the dead seemed closest. Travelers who crossed them after dark risked not only ghosts and spirits, but Empusa herself, lying in wait with the patience of a hunter. She also had a mischievous streak. Ancient texts sometimes portray her less as a relentless predator and more as a prankster spirit, scaring men into running for their lives. This may have been part of her role in comedy, as seen in The Frogs, but it also hints at how Greeks thought of her, not just as a killer, but as a specter of the night, embodying both terror and mockery. In short, Empusa's powers were not the strength of claws or teeth, but the mastery of illusion, fear, and hunger. She thrived in the places where men were weakest: the lonely road, the darkened night, the moment when lust overcame reason. And once caught in her snare, there was no easy escape. For all the whispers and folklore surrounding her, Empusa does not appear often in the preserved texts of Greek literature. One of the clearest glimpses we have of her comes not from a solemn myth or a tragic tale, but from the stage, in the comedy, The Frogs, written by the playwright Aristophanes in 405 BCE. At first, it might seem odd that a creature as terrifying as Empusa would turn up in a comic play. Yet that was the genius of Aristophanes. He took the fears of everyday Athenians, the things they whispered about in the dark, and twisted them into moments of absurdity. In The Frogs, the god Dionysus is traveling into the underworld. On his way, he and his servant Xanthias encounter all manner of strange and frightening things. But nothing unsettles Dionysus quite like the sudden appearance of Empusa. She doesn't simply walk onto the stage in one form. Instead, Aristophanes presents her as constantly shifting, flashing from one shape to another. The audience would have watched her transform into a cow, then a mule, then a beautiful woman, then a dog, then a serpent, each change rapid, startling, and designed to catch both Dionysus and the crowd off guard. The effect was comedic, yes, but also unnerving. Even when laughing, the Athenians in the theater were reminded of the rumors they'd heard about Empusa. That she could never be pinned down, that she was always changing. Dionysus himself is portrayed as terrified. He babbles, panics, and clings to his servant in fear, crying out each time her form changes. Portraying the mighty god of wine, theater, and ecstasy reduced to a frightened fool at the sight of a monster. It's worth remembering that comedy in Athens often relied on shared cultural knowledge. Aristophanes did not need to explain who Empusa was. The very mention of her name, and the sight of her shape-shifting, was enough to draw a reaction. She was already infamous, already a creature of nightmares to the average Athenian. By placing her in a comedy, Aristophanes wasn't erasing her terror, he was using it. He turned her into a punchline, but in doing so, he acknowledged how deeply rooted the fear of Empusa already was. This brief moment on stage is important. It tells us two things. First, that Empusa was well known enough in Greek folklore to appear in popular plays without introduction. And second, that her most defining feature, her ability to shift between terrifying and beautiful forms, was what stuck in the cultural imagination. Even in laughter, the fear of Empusa lingered. Hey everyone, before we continue, I've got some exciting news. My weekly video is now live on my new channel, Index Unknown. That's where I dive into the hidden side of history, the secrets, the theories, the conspiracies, the things they don't want you to know. The latest upload explores the mystery of Egypt in the Grand Canyon, the 1909 story that explorers uncovered hidden caves filled with ancient Egyptian artifacts deep within the cliffs of Arizona. Was it a genuine discovery, a newspaper hoax, or something the Smithsonian didn't want the world to know? The link's below if you're interested. Check it out after this video. While Empusa's moment in The Frogs gave her a place on the Athenian stage, her true life was lived in the stories whispered along lonely paths and firesides. To the Greeks, she was less a character in a single myth and more a presence in the night itself, a spirit who stalked roads, lurked at the edges of villages, and haunted the liminal spaces where the living world brushed against the unseen. As we mentioned earlier, the crossroads were a part of her domain. In Greek thought, the crossroads were places of danger, ruled by spirits and the goddess Hecate. To walk them after dark was to invite misfortune, and Empusa was said to be one of the beings you might encounter there. Travelers told stories of meeting a radiant woman on the road, only to realize too late that her beauty masked something monstrous. Sometimes she drained the life from her victims, leaving them pale and broken. Other times, she vanished in laughter, content to leave a man stumbling home in terror, his heart pounding from the encounter. For children, she was a warning. Parents would invoke her name to keep their little ones from sneaking out at night, painting her as a boogie woman who leapt upon the disobedient. She was the shadow in the corner, the noise outside the door, the figure that kept the young safe inside by frightening them with something far worse. Her association with the moon further deepened her role. Some sources describe her as a night walker under moonlight, her fiery hair and brass leg glinting against the pale glow. This tied her not only to Hecate, but also to the idea of the restless dead, spirits who stirred when the world was dark, feeding on the living when the boundaries of the natural world were weakest. What makes these tales so chilling is how ordinary they are. Unlike the grand monsters slain by heroes, Medusa beheaded by Perseus, the Minotaur killed by Theseus, Empusa's victims were nameless, faceless, everyday people. She wasn't the climax of an epic, she was the horror you might encounter on your way home. That made her both more believable and more terrifying. She also became part of the wider culture of fear around traveling at night in the ancient world. Roads were dangerous, full of thieves, wild animals, and unseen hazards. Empusa embodied all of those dangers in one form: the thief, the beast, the supernatural terror. She was, in many ways, the Greek imagination's answer to the unknown that waited beyond the torchlight. So whether as a predator or a prankster, a devourer or a frightener, Empusa's role in folklore was the same: to remind mortals that the night was never truly safe. Over time, Empusa's identity began to blur. She was not alone in the Greek imagination. The ancient world was populated with many female spirits who shared similar traits, and eventually their stories tangled together like shadows merging in the dark. Chief among these were Lamia and Mormo. Lamia was a figure of tragedy turned horror. Once said to be a Libyan queen, she was cursed by Hera after catching the eye of Zeus. In her grief, Lamia became a child-devouring demoness, hunting infants and feeding on their blood. Mormo, on the other hand, was less a character from myth and more of a boogie woman, a fright tale told to keep children from misbehaving. Like Empusa, she was said to prowl at night, ready to punish the wayward and disobedient. The similarities were striking. All three were associated with Hecate, all three were shapeshifters or tricksters, and all three used their beauty, or at least the illusion of it, to lure victims. They terrified children, seduced men, and reminded women of the dangers lurking in the dark. To the Greeks, they were part of the same supernatural family, bound by common themes of hunger, deception, and the inversion of femininity. By the Hellenistic and later Roman periods, these distinctions grew even murkier. Some writers treated Empusa as a servant of Hecate, while others referred to her as a type of demon, indistinguishable from Lamia or Mormo. In folklore, the names could be swapped out almost interchangeably. A mother might warn her child that Mormo will get you, while another might say, Empusa is coming. To the listener, the effect was the same. This merging of identities speaks to how flexible these figures were. They weren't rigid mythological characters like Zeus or Athena, with long, detailed lineages and clear roles in epic tales. Instead, they were part of a living oral tradition, nightmares given names, shifting to fit the needs of the storyteller. And yet, Empusa retained a certain individuality. Where Lamia was tied to the grief of a mother and Mormo to the discipline of children, Empusa remained most closely linked to the lonely road, the seduction of men, and the direct service of Hecate. She was less of a tragic monster or a cautionary tale, and more of a hunter, a spirit designed to frighten adults as much as children. This blending of figures also laid the groundwork for something greater: the evolution of the archetype. Over time, the traits of Lamia, Mormo, and Empusa fused into a single image, the beautiful woman who conceals a predator, feeding on the life of the unsuspecting. From there, the archetype traveled far beyond Greece, finding echoes in medieval Europe's succubi, in Slavic vampire tales, and in countless cultural fears about women who became hunters rather than nurturers. Empusa, then, was not forgotten. Instead, she became part of a larger, enduring tradition, one that outlived the fall of Olympus itself. When modern readers encounter Empusa, she is often labeled as the Succubus of Greek mythology, and in many ways the comparison works: a demonic woman luring men with beauty, feeding on their life, and embodying the dangers of unchecked desire. But this description, while useful as a shorthand, can also be misleading. The succubus, as we know it today, comes from medieval European demonology. She was described as a female demon who crept into men's chambers at night, seduced them in their sleep, and drained them of their strength. Over time, the succubus became a symbol of forbidden lust, sin, and damnation, a warning wrapped in theology. Empusa, however, was never so neatly defined. She wasn't tied to Christian ideas of sin or morality, nor was she cast as an eternal temptress locked in a cosmic battle between good and evil. Where the succubus was a demon of the bedchamber, Empusa belonged to the road. She was not just a private terror, but a public one, haunting any place the firelight did not reach. She is also sometimes confused with the sirens, another group of female figures associated with seduction and death. But while the sirens lured sailors with their songs, their goal was to wreck ships and consume flesh. Empusa was more direct, appearing in human form, using not song but desire itself as her trap. Where the sirens killed indiscriminately, Empusa's focus was often personal, an encounter on the road, an intimate deception, a private act of consumption. And finally, there's the modern tendency to romanticize her. Some retellings paint Empusa as a tragic figure herself, cursed by Hecate or condemned to a monstrous life she did not choose. While this makes for compelling storytelling, it isn't found in the original sources. To the Greeks, Empusa was not tragic, she was terrifying. She wasn't misunderstood or sympathetic. She was something to be avoided, a predator with no redemption arc. So while it's tempting to call her a succubus or a vampire, or even a tragic anti-hero, the truth is that Empusa was something more primal. She was the fear of the unknown, given form. She was the lurking danger behind every beautiful face, the predator hiding behind charm. And it was this simplicity, this raw embodiment of dread, that kept her name alive long after others were forgotten. She may not be as widely known as other Greek monsters, but her legacy can be felt in countless portrayals of women who are both desired and feared. Perhaps that is her truest legacy. She represents an ancient anxiety that has never fully gone away. The fear that desire can destroy, the fear that beauty hides danger, the fear that the night holds something waiting, something that smiles as it feeds. In the end, Empusa's story isn't just about a monster of Greek folklore. It's about the human imagination and how it returns again and again to the same shadows. For as long as people fear the dark, Empusa will never truly vanish.